share my screen again. You see my screen now, right?
Perfect.
You see my screen?
Yes, it's there.
Okay. Then, well, we continue then with the previous. It's been intense. It's been 4 lectures in a row, so that's co+labo intensity.
More than 4. Thanks for that, Rafa. It was really good. But not
no. My pleasure. My pleasure. Actually, I've been wanting to share some of these ideas and concepts since long time ago. So I had a lot of material. I definitely something had been thinking since long time ago. So it was a good opportunity also to download all this to a more intelligible presentation. So as I was presenting before, I called this presentation Daedalus language, and I previously was introducing precisely the relevance of Daedalus as not only as an engineer but as a person who came up with unique ideas and whose idea of the labyrinth could make some or trigger investigations about how to represent this maze or this lab. So I will just go through some of the ideas that I was presenting in the previous presentation, which I think are relevant to link with the next slides that I couldn't show the last time. So well, the presentation basically will spin in 3 axes, which is well, all it's, of course, maybe the main backbone would be creativity, but basically expanding on graphic representation, which is something that we elaborated on the last presentation about saying about how we are not only image consumers in the case of architects and urban planners, but also image producers. So we are in this cycle of consuming and producing images. And today we're going to focus more in the idea of diagrammatic thinking, which I think is relevant to discuss precisely because we use this language, for communicating ideas, or as I was commenting before, to convey these communicative transactions. So in this case, we have to understand that diagrammatic thinking is embedded or is part of the realm of graphic representation. In the previous presentation, we of course defined a little bit wider what was graphic representation, but today we're going to think more about diagrammatic thinking. In the previous presentation too, we were also expanding about the idea of creativity, and we were using precisely, or I was pointing out this model, which is Amabille's model from 2012, where she was commenting, or where she expands that creativity, it's a combination between expertise, or something that we call knowledge, basically either technical, procedural, or intellectual, about the motivation, of course, of the person, which is more intrinsic, we could say, the passions that you have for something, and finally the skills that you gain through the experience. It's related to imagination and problem solving. So we commented this before, as those who came in the previous presentation, we already went through these images. Yeah, we were stressing in the previous presentation too about the power of the eye, of the observer. How at the end producing images is, of course, appealing to the eye, but we were also establishing other connections between the hand, the brain, and the eye. We were saying also that especially with the way we see things is in a way bound by what we believe, or sometimes I would even add to what we have seen, what we have already experienced. So I think that also bounds a lot the way we understand and we represent things. I was also trying to explain at that time how we can never see something as an absolute in its absolute totality. We usually tend to see things only partially. And I was putting the example of this frog, which changes its skin every certain season, and then you can see all this information or all these patterns in the skin completely unfolded. No, this was it's something that Edward Tufte points out in one of his books called Visioning Information, which is basically how we can represent something which is so three-dimensional into something much more b-dimensional. No, all the complexities that are embedded in the reality and how we need to reduce them in order to represent them. No? Well, this is precisely what I was commenting. No, that the world is complex, dynamic, multidimensional, and the paper in a way is static. No, it's flat. So how are we to represent the rich visual world of experience and measurements on mere flat land? No, that's a question that is still relevant and probably also interesting to imagine in the future, because I think the paper is more and more something from the 20th century, and now we start to be confined to our screens. I mean, still our screens are b-dimensionals, but we are having a complete different connection now with the world and the way we represent it through the computers, definitely. And I showed many examples at that time, but I think this example for me is one of the most relevant that I would like to continue, or just to connect, precisely because this idea of delayering information is very, very important when we are thinking about this diagramming. So this is the work of Tomohiro Kazaki. I was commenting that he has a program called Design A in the NHK in Japan, and he always starts some short capsules where he shows first some elements from our everyday use or objects. Could be fruits or even elements that we use all every day, and then he tries to represent this in this way. For example, the orange, which is deconstructed in a way, and it's in a way the same element but not the same. I mean, because basically when we see this orange, we can never see the content of that of the components making the totality of that element, and then we can understand a little more how this is something also about the scale, I would say, because he organizes the information in a way that he doesn't even need to put any kind of words or anything. It simply renders by itself certain kind of logics and organizational compositions between the parts and the whole. This is the other image that is also the grapes, and you can also understand in the same fashion this representation of those elements. No, and as I said, the way you organize information in order to be presented, it also matters. I was also talking about the relevance of the hand, how the hand also has certain kind of memory, and at least in my experience, I believe that the hand has a very strong power of memory, and has this capacity or capability of collecting information even when we are not aware of it. No, I was commenting the example of drawing certain kind of buildings or details, and how you always tend to remember these details because your hand passed through this process of mincing the information that was presented in front of you. And something interesting also that I like to stress here is what Finnish thinker or architect Juhani Palasmaa talks about the how we have the way we use the visuals is in a way a kind of tactile quality that we are trying to achieve. No? So he says that all the senses, including vision and hearing, are extensions of the tactile senses. These senses are specializations of the skin tissue, and all sensory experiences are modes of touching and thus related to tactility. So it's different ways of touching, we could say. So I commented about all these things in the previous presentation. Of course, this is just some of the things that I wanted to stress, because today we would like to go more about the diagrammatic thinking. I finally was commenting about the how this the creativity for me is definitely not something that you are born with only. Definitely, there's people who have more skills than others, and that's something that is innate, we could say. But we also have the skills that are learned, which is by experience, and that means this vast visual culture that we start to collect as much as we see things, as much as we travel, as much as we talk with people, as much as we train the skills, which is the third source of the skills or creativity. And finally, we were saying also about the loss of simplicity, which in a way, when we render information, and I think in this case, even more relevant in the case of diagramming, we need to think in the most simplistic way possible. So some of the laws that are presented here by John Maeda in this book called the Laws of Simplicity are relevant to talk about diagramming or to diagrammatic thinking. Even the laws themselves, in this case, are presented diagrammatically. So each one of them is presented through lines, arrows, or with words. So they communicate something with very simple information. So I think that's the way I would like to stress today that we can achieve in diagrammatic thinking. No? So we need to be more reductive. We need to organize in a certain way our information. I mean, there are other ones that are relevant, but for me, the most important is the last one, no? Which is the one he calls the one, which is simplicity is about subtracting the obvious and adding the meaningful. So it might be obvious for you, especially when you are designing something, because you are swimming in the waters that you know, but you can never see the process from outside. So sometimes what is obvious for you is not obvious for the others, for the other observers. So in a way, diagrammatic thinking, it's not only self-educative or self-illustrative, but also for the others. No, so it acts in two levels. First for you, but also for the persons who are going to receive this information. So going directly, or more specifically, with the idea of a diagram, we need to go first to some of the definitions that we have about diagrams. So I will go one by one. So one says a simplified drawing showing the appearance, the structure, or working of something, or a schematic representation. Again, we come to this idea of representing. So we know that we are in the realm of the representation. But we have some interesting keywords there to put attention to, like simplifying. No, I think that's one of the important things, and the appearance to how it looks, how it's structured. Then it also says a symbolic representation of information using visualization techniques. So it talks about techniques, for example. So I think that's very important because, in a way, we can have certain. I would say, techniques is it's something that we can learn. It's something that we can acquire by different kind of usage of programs, or sometimes even our personal sensibilities that we add to these presentations. An illustrative figure giving only the outlines or general scheme of the object. Again, I think all of these definitions are talking about the reductionist approach to what we are going to represent. Then a drawing for the purpose of demonstrating the properties of a figure. So this also talks a lot about abstraction. When there's properties of something, we need to understand that we have to mince the information and just put the basics of these things that we want to present. No? And then from Greek diagramma, a geometric figure which is marked out by lines. And here they introduce the idea of lines, which I think is something that in diagrammatic thinking it's relevant to talk about lines. And then from dia, which is across, through, and graphein, which is write, mark, and draw. So these are some definitions of the idea of diagramming or a diagram. And then we go to some more specific examples. So this is one that I really like, because when you are making a diagram of something, you are revealing information that is not obviously there. So, for example, one of the things that is revealed here in the writing of the kanji, it's the direction or the flow of the traces, or the stroke, is something that you can kind of uh, make or assume intuitively, or simply not even think about it. But when you start to see the diagram, which is in red there, you can understand that there is a flow of the forces of the brush over the paper. And I think that's something that it's powerful. The diagram is not the thing, so that's something that we have to learn, or that I'm going to stress too. The diagram is not the thing that we are. It's just another type of representation, which is abstractional, reductionist too. But at the same time, it unveils the process that you went through to reach to something that you are seeing in a kind of finished state. This is a very famous diagram that probably you know. It's a diagram that Andy Warhol did in 1962 about dancing. And it's interesting how something that is uh, so vital, or so active, vibrant as dancing, can be reduced to just some information with some fit, some directions, some basic words. So this is precisely diagrammatic thinking. So we have here the two fit, just one L and one R representing the two fit, and then the movements of a dance. So that's, I think, is at the same time there's a content of beauty too in the way we represent the things. I'm sure if I ask you a diagram of how you dance, you would come up with a different idea, or maybe something similar. But we have to understand also, if we're representing, in this case, he's representing from the plant. And I think he's highlighting the most important element in dancing, which is the fit in this case. No? So the fit is what he's trying to point out. Probably when you dance, you move other parts of your body, like your hands, or you shake other parts of the body. But the fit is the thing that is marking the rhythm here, which is quite relevant for this diagram. There's another diagram which is even more simplistic, but it's also beautiful. How you start to make a spin in a dance. Also Andy Warhol, but I think the beauty of the information here is fantastic. I mean, just you can think about that exercise of dancing just by seeing a simple diagram. And historically speaking, there are many important or relevant diagrams that have been created. No? This is, for example, the famous color wheel that Moses Harris presented in 1766, which is basically the first time that someone put colors together, and also tried to render to the people the idea that the three primary colors can lead to the black color, for example. So that's something that was new. So in a way, also the information that you put and the way you organize it creates certain kind of visual impact. This is also an interesting diagram, because it talks more about patents, which I think they have been done since the 19th century. This is precisely the first patent for the car that Mercedes was doing. Well, at that time, it was not called Mercedes-Benz; it was only Benz. And this is the first patent that they were presenting for the car that they were trying to propose to have production. So we have last time Sanja was commenting about for who is this information, and it's very interesting. I think that question also actually made me think a lot, because yes, the diagram needs to think one step ahead of who is going to be the person who's going to receive this information. So in this case, if it's for a patent, it needs to have all the specifications so that it can be reproducible. No? So that's in this case, it's something that wants to be repeated. If you make a competition, for example, you know that you want to address some jury, and you need to have clarity in the ideas. You need to have the less words possible and the most representation of whatever you're attempting to transmit to the people. This is also a relevant diagram from Galileo Galilei from 1610, and he's the first person who basically started to point out that the moon was not flat, because at that time there was no telescopes, and he was the first person who represented the moon in different phases, but also pointing out that it had crests and valleys, and that it had a very porous surface. No, also without going there, he made his own representation, but also aided by the microscope. This is also a representation, it's a diagrammatic representation of the book of the Purgatorium, and well, basically all the Dante's Divine Comedy. So you can see how if you see my arrow there, is going from the Purgatorium, and it's going different strata until reaching the sky. No? So this is just a representation of a text in this case, but diagrammatically speaking. So you can see different levels which are going to the center of the Earth. I'm very interested in specifically in the idea of diagramming coming from Francis Bacon. I mean, Francis Bacon was one of the artists who openly was using the word diagramming in his process of design or creating his art. There's also a very interesting book where Gilles Deleuze starts to analyze the diagrams or this diagrammatic approach that Francis Bacon was doing in his painting. So I'm going to read this because I think it's quite relevant. This is something that Gilles Deleuze is stressing on. The diagram is thus the operative set of asignifying and non-representative lines and zones, line, strokes, color patches. And the operation of diagram, its function, says Bacon, is to be suggestive, or more rigorously, the use language, similar to Wittgenstein's, is to introduce possibilities of fact. This is why they are not sufficient in themselves, but must be utilized. So from this text, I think there are many interesting things, because basically Bacon would start his method of painting was creating this kind of lines or recognizing zones in his paintings. Bacon was also saying that they were not enough to represent or to have to make all the artistic creation, but they were in a way just an important component in how he started to understand the space between himself, which was more inner process, and then this fight with the canvas. No? This is an example, no? How Bacon was creating. This is a face, but it's not a face at the same time. I mean, it's a representation of a face, but you cannot see the diagram, because I think this is what I would call a reverse diagram, because the way Bacon starts making diagramming is from the beginning of the process, and at the end he erases with the painting. But still you can see how these zones and areas are still indicated. You still can understand that there is a nose, there are two pair of eyes and mouth. Even when there's a deformation of the whole system, you can understand that there are these zones that he called in his process. So then first, or one of the ideas that I want to point out here is that the diagram is not the project. As I was saying, the diagram is only one of the many components that you need as a tool, you use as a tool to present some ideas. And it's also important to understand the idea of delayering. No? That I guess we all understand what it is, but it's basically just to mince the information and to present it in the most simplistic and more intelligible way for the people who is going to receive this information. This is a good example of the layering. There's a famous book from the AA, which is a student who made this book. His name is Mark Garcia in 2010. It's called The Diagrams of Architecture, which I think is too architectural. I personally think the diagram it can operate in different levels, but well, this is more focused in architecture. And what you can see basically just the juxtaposition of three elements, and at the end presented just as a whole understanding of, in this case, it was some urban studies. Another important thing is that naming is understanding when we are making a diagram. So when you put a name to the things, you start to understand what you want to say. So just putting lines for putting lines, it could be maybe the cognitive process, a very basic or very primitive approach to what you want to say, but then you need to name it, because basically language is something that we share all, and as we have this capability of communicating, we can understand each other when we use certain kind of words. So it's important to name things, because then you start to understand what you want to say, and the others can start to follow your arguments. No? So as I was saying, the diagram is self-educative as much as illustrative for the general public. And the other thing is understanding the forces. That's something that I call in diagramming, or a word that I use a lot, which is the forces in the system. So basically, those forces can come in different directions. We have basically external forces, we could say. I mean, those external forces, specifically in a project, could be, I don't know, social, historical, political, economical, geographical. Could be the weather, could be even the cost, could be the materials, could be different kind of constraints which are happening externally from you and that you have to render in this diagram. And then the internal forces, which are, of course, more intentional and is more related to the process of design and is showing precisely the operations that we are doing in the process of design. And this is what I'm saying, no? The field of operations. Basically, the operations, and I commented last time that used also in medicine, for example, and it's very chirurgical, like where you put things and in which position. So it's very methodological, we could say, and it's trying to unveil the process of design of a project. This kind of diagrams can help us to understand a little this kind of thinking. Just starting by the site and how you pull things. How it's you could say we are. It's kind of making a sculpture or a mental sculpture of each one of the steps that you follow to render the ideas, because basically we receive the information completely finished, and the idea with the diagram is to go back to the process of the design, of how you started understanding the problem, and which were the steps that you did in order to reach to that final product. So this is one project for social housing from Studio Walk in Milan, and you can understand first how they put words, colors. It's very simplistic too. I think that's something that is important to understand in the diagram. The less colors you use, the better you can understand the things. So when you want to highlight something, and I'm talking about this very specific example, you use one color, and that's the one that your eye is going to recognize to follow as the important information. So we receive information in certain way, and we are manipulating also the person who's going to receive that information. So just by the employment of these these basic tools, we can make much easier the navigation of the process for the people. No? This is the typical example, no, which is just having some boxes. Especially, I think it's a thinking from the box. It's something very architectural, and then we start to pull things, or we start to stretch things. This is also a way of communicating, which is very effective in a way. No? And we all know about all these specifically big Bjarke Ingels. How he has created a complete school of representation and diagrammatic thinking. I think ideally it's better when you start to create your own language, your own techniques. But I think as it works well just to start to represent your ideas, and it's very clear. No, you push the lower part and you push the other, and then you create some kind of mouth which is under that element, and people can enter. It's so it's very clear. And again, as I was saying, this is not the project, but it starts to give hints of how the project was logically constructed. This is some diagrams. I was trying to be a little more personal in the presentation, just so we can go in more detail about how to think a diagram. It was for a house that we were designing around 12 years ago, and we were requested to make a prototype for a very small house, which was basically square. It doesn't matter the scale, by the way, of the diagram in many cases, because it's sometimes not scalar, so you can take advantage of that freedom of scalarity. So this one talks about the deformation of the of the boundaries. No, so we start with something that I call a system. So this is precisely a system given by 4 points. So you have the 4 points connected with one line, which creates one square. So that's our first system. Then we introduce the second system, which is geometrically different. It's not a square. It's a triangle, and it's intersecting part of this first system, and acts in a different way. So also you need to assign different letters, because you can understand that is a different system. So one is with A, B, C, D. The other is X, Y, Z. Then we create a result of these two, of the juxtaposition of these two elements, creating three resultant pieces or rooms, we could say, within that space. Then we introduce some subcomponents in the space. In this case, these were ceilings or that skylight that we wanted to put in each room, just to create light coming from the top and not from the sides. Start to deform. This is a manipulation of all this, all created by these three ceilings in a rectangular space, square parcel. Eventually, we go to the next stage, which is stretching or trying to break the boundaries of the first system, and that's by precisely projecting those ceilings to the outer part of the original system, and eventually, well, we reach. I think I don't have the other image, but there was one more where we have the result of all these elements which are moving in this composition, which is basically in plan in this case. I usually work or just as also I think it's a little bit anecdotic this presentation. Sometimes I just analyze graphic things just for the pleasure of analyzing them and trying to understand the complexities within the systems, as I call them. So this is a painting that grabbed my attention from Vasarely, which is called Usok, number 2, from the 50s, and I was trying to understand how he composed these pieces, because they are not the same. For example, if you start to see, the pieces are a little bit different, and I was trying to understand how Vasarely came up with this idea. So then I went through this process of first cleaning the image, so just understanding which are the pieces, retracing it, and understanding the components too, just breaking into different elements, like assigning different letters, and then trying to make this in a very rational way. So this is how it is constructed by Vasarely, and this is a kind of logic way of putting what he's representing in a more complex way. Eventually, you start to see what is the the behavior of all these lines within the space, within the canvas. So you start to note certain nodes, certain angles, and you start to discover what are the secrets within that compositions. For example, this was certain degrees tilted, and that's what created this all the movement in the the abstract composition. This is another example, which is one chair from a Finnish designer, Mikko Mertz. And again, I guess many of these things are triggered by curiosity. It was just some studies about this tool, and we wanted to understand how it was composed, this element. So we had to retrace the element, basically draw it in plan, and try to understand how everything was composed. Eventually, we understood that something that would look as complex as this is basically broken into two basic elements, as simple as that. No? So it only has one A piece and one B leg, which organizes all the elements in a certain way. But eventually, I'm almost at the end of my slides. This is another example of how we are representing something which is very intelligible for everyone, which is a face. Very similar to the example of Bacon, no, that he was presenting just the two eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And eventually, when we start to diagrammatically play or deform the relationships between all these components, we can reach to something like this, no, which becomes kind of monstrous. We have the eyes on the parts of the jaw, or the mouth would be on the forehead, or the nose would be stressed to another direction. So in a way, the diagram, it's still very elegant in this. I'm not talking about this one, but in general, a good diagram has the power to communicate without too much information, just the basic information. Also with some few colors, some few lines. Sometimes the width of the line can say a lot. Some arrows can just talk about directions and emphasize these forces within the system. No? And as I was presenting before, this image, I put the example of the clock or the machine in this case, how we always tend to see from one perspective, but when you start to see all the layers that make the totality of this of the machinery of all these elements, of all the clock in this case, we can understand what is relevant and what we want to emphasize, because of course this is only the side, but then you need to choose which one has more hierarchy than the other, and how you want to present it to the person who is going to receive the information. So I think that's the end of my slides. We went through 151 slides, and then we can continue.